So I think now that we've refactored our procedural programming approach across to this object literal has given us a new sense of structure. And we want to avoid things such as floating variables and functions all over the place. And we want to tie things together in the form of an object. Now in this lesson, what we're going to look at is the concept of a factory function. Now a factory function you may have heard of before. It essentially allows us to construct and return hopefully a new object. Now in JavaScript, any kind of function can return an object. If we were to use the new keyword, we would in fact be instantiating a class or a constructor. However, in JavaScript, a true factory function will not use the new keyword. However, it will still give us a brand new object. So this is kind of the step before learning about classes and prototypes and inheritance and the new keyword. And we're keeping things as simple as possible by just sticking to an object literal. Now, let's assume that we have some kind of e-commerce website. We have a cart. Now, typically when you're browsing an e-commerce website, you have kind of a mini cart, maybe in the top right of the corner of the page, and you can see the items that you've added. If you were to then click on it, you'd probably go through to the cart page where you'd have the similar behavior where you can add and remove items. So to me, there might be two different carts that we might want to create, and we might want to set them up slightly differently. So this is where the object could be transformed into a factory function, which returns us a new object per cart. Now, we're not going to build a great big UI. I think we can imagine what a small cart and a cart page will act and look like. But here we're just learning the concept of taking an object literal and allowing us to reuse it many times, because at the moment we just have one cart object. We can't easily reuse it. We would have to keep making copies and copies. So essentially the factory function allows us to generate a new cart anytime we would call this create cart function, which we'll then create in a moment. So instead of our const of cart, what I'm going to do is create a new constant, and we're going to call this create a cart. Now we are going to assign this a function. Here I'm going to use an arrow function, and then inside the body of the function, we can then return a new object. Now what is this object going to be? It's going to be everything that we have down here. So in fact, we could go and grab this and eradicate our cart and then simply replace our return block. So we should ideally have something that looks a little bit like this. We have create cart. We don't have any arguments or parameters at the moment coming through the function, but inside the body, we're then simply returning a new object each time. So to go ahead and create the first object of our cart, we would need to do something like this, where we can in fact say const cart is now going to be the result of calling create cart. So we are encapsulating our object even further and abstracting it away using some of the principles of object-oriented programming. Now at the moment, our cart is an empty array. We might want to perhaps use some demo data, and we might want to pass in a few objects inside an array. So it would be good to have the ability to pass in the initial items to our cart. So here what I'm going to do is say items. However, if we do not specify, such as an empty array, which would be how we can initialize things, then I'm actually going to provide an empty array as the fallback. So this means that we can in fact instantiate our cart like so. We don't need to pass in an empty array. Now what's also nice is we have this items, so I can actually remove our array here because it's going to take our items argument name and bind it as a new property with the value of our array. So this is pretty much exactly what that is going to give us by declaring it as a default function parameter. Now if we go ahead and save this out, you can see that we have our one item in the array and 0 items in the array. So behaviorally, nothing has really changed. However, we're now wrapping things inside a create cart. So you could assume that we could have a mini cart, for example, and then we could create one kind of cart, and we could have another cart and another cart, and it's completely up to you. Now, a shopping cart might not be the best example to show you how to create lots and lots of new objects, but you could think of messages in a chat application, for example, and each message could be an object with a timestamp, an ID, and the actual message and who it was from. Each time, this would probably call create message and pass some details in, such as the sender and so forth. But the idea here is that the implementation details are hidden away inside a factory function. Now, what's nice in ES 2015 or ES6 is that we are using these arrow functions instead of the function keyword. Now, because we're just simply returning an object literal here, we could in fact go and eradicate some code even further. Now, currently this approach allows me to potentially create some variables up here inside our function closure. Because we have access to the body of the function of create cart, we could look at items, we could do anything we like, and then we simply return him. However, if we do not need to do anything up here, for example, and we just simply want to return a new object, we can do something a little bit like this, where we can look like we return an object, but we need to wrap it in these brackets. So this is actually using ES 2015 arrow functions implicit return, whereby it's returning us an object literal. However, because if we undo those changes, the body of the function or the opening curly brace of the function looks like an object literal, we can in fact wrap it in an expression. Otherwise, JavaScript's going to think it's the body of the function. So this is a nice one-liner that we can create to just simply return an object literal and, most importantly, a new object literal. So if we were to do something like this and create cart, create cart, create cart, we could do it as many times as we like. We're going to get a different object every single time, and you would of course have to do something like this to then add items to those individual carts. So this is one of the key learnings in object-oriented programming, this idea of factory functions and abstraction. We want to keep our behavior encapsulated even more by using a pure function here, and we're going to evolve this into the idea of classes as well as we continue. But essentially what this has allowed us to do is encapsulate an object. Nobody can dive in here and start mutating any of our values, or can they? That is an interesting question. So what we could in fact do, and this comes back to this mutable data, even though that we've encapsulated everything inside a function, we're still returning an object which is fully mutable. I can start grabbing the items. I could replace the functions if I really wanted to. And again, this comes back to the concept of immutable data structures. So because we have our cart, we could in fact say items. We can say 0 and 1. Now, when we save this, this is going to remove the item. What we're going to do is just console log our cart afterwards. But if we save this out, you can see that by using a mutable method on our cart, instead of our add and remove utility methods or our behavioral methods, and we can in fact start removing things, which leaves our cart potentially open to bugs or potentially having some of the data being hijacked by people who are playing around with our JavaScript in the developer tools console. We don't want to encourage patterns and behaviors that would allow us to be hacked. Or at least we can mitigate some of those shortcomings by thinking about frozen state and immutable practices. And that's exactly what we are going to be covering in the next video. But I think this tees us up nicely. We have our create cart, we've learned about factory functions, we're returning our object literal, we're not using the new keyword, which we would do with a class, we're just simply calling a function that returns us a new object every single time. We have, however, learned that we can start splicing these particular items, which we might not want to do because it leaves our data and behavior open to being changed on the client. So what we're going to do in the next video is address this problem that our items can be spliced, they can be mutated by absolutely anyone. So that's it for this video. We've talked about encapsulating our object literals inside of a factory function and the great benefits of doing so.